whispering shadows. Graveyards had never frightened me. In fact, I found them strangely peaceful, a haven of quiet amidst the chaos of life. So when my friends dared me to spend a night in the old cemetery at the edge of town, I accepted without hesitation. The tales of ghostly apparitions and eerie whispers didn't faze me. I was determined to prove them wrong. It was a chilly October night when I stepped through the creaking iron gate, armed with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. The moon was a silver coin in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows over the tombstones. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. At first, everything was uneventful. I wandered among the graves, reading the inscriptions and imagining the lives of those buried beneath. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, carried on the breeze. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. It came again, this time clearer.
Leave.
My breath hitched. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. My rational mind told me it was the wind playing tricks, but the whisper had sounded so human. I shook my head and pressed on, determined not to let fear take hold. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent.
Leave. You don't belong here.
They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding me. My flashlight flickered, and my heart raced. I turned to leave, but my legs felt heavy, as though the earth itself was trying to hold me back. Shadows began to move among the graves, darker than the night, shapeless yet undeniably present. My throat tightened as I realized they were moving toward me.
Go.
The whispering voices screamed in unison, their tone urgent and angry. I ran, stumbling over gravestones and fallen branches, my flashlight useless in my shaking hand. The whispers turned to a deafening roar, chasing me all the way to the gate. As I scrambled through, I looked back one last time. The shadows had stopped at the edge of the cemetery, watching silently. I could feel their gaze, even in the dark. I've never gone back to that graveyard. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. The Crying Child. It was just past midnight when I arrived at the cemetery. I had promised my grandmother I'd visit her grave every week, and I'd kept that promise, even if it meant coming late after work. The graveyard was empty, the usual bustle of visitors replaced by an eerie stillness under the pale light of the moon. I found her grave easily. It was the one with the white roses I always left. Kneeling beside the headstone, I began talking to her, sharing updates about my life as if she were still alive. It was something that brought me comfort. Then I heard it, a soft, heart-wrenching sob. It was faint at first, like the sound of a child crying far away. I paused, my words catching in my throat, and looked around. The cemetery was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The crying stopped. I waited, straining to hear any sound, but the silence was oppressive. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but as I turned back to the grave, I saw her, a little girl standing a few rows away. Her figure was partially hidden by a weathered tombstone. She wore a white dress, old-fashioned and tattered, and her hair hung in limp curls over her face. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward her. She didn't answer. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me, and my stomach dropped. Her eyes were dark voids, empty and unseeing, and tears streaked her pale cheeks. My legs felt like lead, but I managed to take another step toward her. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice trembling. She pointed to a nearby grave, her hand shaking. I followed her gesture and saw an old, crumbling headstone with an inscription so worn I could barely read it. But one word stood out: Emily. When I turned back to the girl, she was gone. My heart pounded as I scanned the cemetery, but there was no sign of her. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I didn't sleep that night. I returned the next day to research the grave, and what I found chilled me to the bone. Emily had been a 7-year-old girl who died tragically in a fire nearly a century ago. Visitors had often reported seeing her ghost crying near her grave. Now, whenever I visit, I bring an extra rose for Emily. I haven't seen her again, but I feel her presence, watching, waiting. Three, the keeper of the gate. I worked as a night watchman at the city cemetery, a job most people would never want. But I liked the solitude, the peace. My nights were usually uneventful, until that night. It was around 2 a.m. when I noticed something strange. One of the motion sensor lights near the cemetery's gate flickered on and off. It wasn't unusual. Animals sometimes triggered the sensors. Still, I decided to check it out. As I approached the gate, I saw a man standing just inside the cemetery, facing away from me. He was tall and dressed in an old, black coat that looked like it belonged to another era. His presence was unsettling, but I called out anyway. "Sir, the cemetery is closed. You'll need to leave." He didn't move. I took a step closer, and the air around me grew cold, unnaturally cold. The man slowly turned his head to look at me, and I froze. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and glowing faintly red.
You don't belong here,
He said, in a voice that seemed to echo from all directions. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't obey. The man raised his hand and pointed toward the heart of the cemetery. Against my will, I turned to look. In the distance, I saw faint, glowing figures moving among the graves, their forms flickering like dying flames. When I turned back, the man was gone. The gate was closed, locked as it had been before. I spent the rest of my shift inside the guardhouse, trembling and clutching my flashlight. The next morning, I told my boss I couldn't work there anymore. I never went back, but sometimes I still dream about that man, standing at the gate, watching me with those glowing eyes. Leave a token of your visit, like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell. Every act lights a path to the shadows, where more stories await.